Today, our meditation on the theme being with marginalized and outcasts. Being with marginalized and outcasts. According to the Webster Dictionary, marginalized means people who are pushed aside by society and not given the same rights, opportunities, or respect as others. They are treated as less important. For example, poor people, Dalits, women, and so on. And the meaning of outcasts is people who are completely rejected by the society. People who are completely rejected by the society and seen as unworthy or untouchable. Outcast. Friends, one day a young boy named Beam sat in classroom. Eager to learn, he was intelligent, with full of dreams and determined to study hard. But unlike other children, Beam faced something that broke his heart, and he was not allowed to drink water from the common pot. He had to sit separately, and his teachers treated him as if he was not as human because he belonged to the so-called untouchable caste, and society had already decided that he was unworthy of dignity. One scorching afternoon, Beam was extremely thirsty. He saw a pot of water nearby. He knew that he was not allowed to touch it. But with trembling hands, he asked a teacher for some water. Instead of kindness, the teacher looked at him with disgust and refused. That day, Beam realized that people like him, millions of Dalits, were suffering not because by their lacked intelligence or the hard work, but because the society had pushed them to the margins, treating them as outcasts. Some heroes have sports, some lead armies, but the greatest heroes change hearts and minds. One such hero was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. A man who rose from the depths of oppression to become the voice of the voiceless, the strength of the weak, and the hope of the hopeless. He was born into a world that tried to silence him, but he was refused to remain silent. Though water was denied to him, but he produced the streams. He was rejected by the society, but he embraced the millions who were cast aside. He was humiliated, but he stood taller than his oppressors. Dr. Ambedkar was not just a leader, but he was a revolution in human form. With unshakable courage and unbreakable spirit, he wrote the India's destiny. He crafted the Constitution, ensuring that dignity, equality, and freedom would not be privileges for the few, but for the rights for all. He shattered the chains that had bound generations, and it flames that still burns in the hearts of the oppressed. Ambedkar's life is a testament. His life is a testament that true greatness is not inherited, but it is forged in the fire of the struggle. He stood with the marginalized and outcast, just as Jesus stood with the sinners, the lepers, and the marginalized and the forgotten. The Ambedkar's mission was not only just a political, but it was deeply spiritual, driven by the belief that every human being observes dignity. Today, as we reflect on the theme, being with the marginalized and outcast, let us remember the hero who walked before us. To honor Ambedkar is to continuation his mission, to break barriers, uplift the downtrodden, and stand for justice. Because heroes do not exist in history, they are born every time we choose to fight for what is right. Dear friends, we are all part of the church, right? We are all part of this church, from pastors to watchmen. How many of you know the name of our watchmen? Yet, we often treat them harshly, judging them based on our social status, economical stability, and our position within the church. Just think, when events like Christmas celebrations, festivals, or harvest fest gatherings take place, have you ever asked that person about his lunch or dinner? Just think. He might be the same age of your father. He might be the same age of your brother. He might be the same age of your grandfather. Would you treat your family members that way? I'm sorry to say this, but by following the so-called traditions, Anglican or Presbyterian traditions, without compassion, you are not truly following that Christ. If you say, sir, we are belong to the Anglican church without compassion, you are not a Christ follower. Friends, do not forget one thing, that his life is part of our past. His life is part of our past. Just think back to the social and economical conditions in our villages 150 years ago. What was happened? What is the situation? What was the situation? We are outcast and marginalized. We are outcast and marginalized. We had no right to wear good clothes. We had not access to education. We had no proper medicines. And we were even denied the right to drink water from the public taps. That was our past. Don't forget our past. Today God has lifted us, right? Today God has lifted us. Yet as Dalits in India, we still experiencing the pain and pathos and poverty. We know this pain all too well. So why do we tolerate the mistreatment of the poor? Remember, we are made in the image of God. If you abuse him, it means indirectly we are abusing the creator, that who created him. For generations, Dalits were treated outcasts, denied respect, education, and basic human rights. In every corner of our life, from schools to churches, the message was clear that we are unworthy. This harsh reality forced us to ask some questions as a Christians. Where is the God who cares for us in our situations? Where is the God in our situations? Where is the God in our pain and pathos? Why God is silent? With these questions, the theologians started to read the Bible from the different lens. Reading from the different perspective, the shift was changed. Usually, how we used to read Bible, do you know? From the post-colonial mind setup. But the theologians began to read the Bible with the fresh eyes from the eyes of the Dalit. Reading Bible from the perspective of Dalit. Reading Bible through and from our experience. Finally, theologians like Arvind P. Nirmal, James Massey, V. Devasahayam, M.E. Prabhakar, Abraham, John Webster, and Theophilus Apavo, in their observations, they discovered the God who stands with the poor, the suffering, and the forgotten, God who fights for the justice and the integrity or the dignity. They found Dalit in Jesus. They found Dalit in Jesus. That's why the Dalit theology was there today. This realization burned a fire within our hearts, a powerful call to stand up against oppression and demand equality. Dear friends, today Dalit theology is more than an academic discussion, it is a rallying cry. It proclaims that every person is made in the image of God and deserves the same respect and justice. The Dalit theology challenges us to break free from the chains of prejudice and to build a world where every voice matters. Standing with outcasts, a call to courage and compassion. Today we read the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse from 1 to 17. The story of Esther is one of the most powerful narrative in the Bible. It is all about the standing for justice. Standing for justice. In Esther chapter 4, we see a turning point in the story where Esther must make a choice whether to stay in her privileged position as queen or risk her life to stand with the marginalized and outcast of her people. The context is the Jewish people were facing annihilation due to Haman's wicked plot or plan. And Mordecai, a faithful Jew, takes a public stand in mourning and protest against the Hamans. Esther living in the comfort of the palace. Initially hesitates, but Mordecai's words challenge her. In Esther chapter 4, verse 14, we could see that. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This verse speaks deeply to our Christian calling today. God places us in some positions not for our own benefit, but so that we can stand with the oppressed and marginalized. In this sermon, we will explore, in this pericope, we will explore 3 lessons from the book of Esther. The first lesson is, we could see in Esther chapter 4, verse from 1 to 4, identifying with the outcasts. Identifying with the outcasts. When Mordecai learns of the decree to destroy the Jews, his response is immediate. We could see in Esther in verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. Mordecai does not hide his sorrow. He makes a public statement by wearing a sackcloth and ashes. The sackcloth and ashes are symbols of deep mourning. But notice that His mourning is not just for a personal grief, it is also a form of protest. It is also a form of protest. Dear friends, standing with the outcasts means public identification. Public identification. Mordecai did not mourn in private place. He stood outside of the palace, visible to everyone, showing solidarity with his people. Today we are called to do the same. Jesus identified with the outcasts. He ate with tax collectors, he healed lepers, and he touched the untouchable. We could see in Matthew chapter 9, verse from 10 to 13, and Luke chapter 5, verse from 12 to 13. We cannot ignoring suffering. Esther was inside the palace. Is initially unaware of the crisis outside. This is a danger we all face. When we are comfortable, we may not see the pain of others. When we are comfortable, we may not see the pain of others. But we are called to open our eyes and open our hearts to those who suffer. That is the ministry and mission of our church. That is the mission and ministry of our church. Today, we are comfortable in our churches, right? We are comfortable in our churches. Yes, but have you ever paused to think why? What was the reason behind that? It is because of the missionaries who dedicated their lives to serving us. Think about our ancestors' lives before missionaries' arrival. How difficult and hopeless it must have been. Missionaries from different countries came to us, embraced us when we are considered untouchable, fed the hungry, educated the unprivileged, and fought against the social evils that oppressed us. Because of their sacrifices, because of their dedications, we enjoy the privileges we have today. Look around. Who built this church? Who built this Salt Saints Church? The so-called missionaries. But we are enjoying this privilege. They didn't just construct buildings. They built communities. They built communities. They transformed lives and they spread the love of Christ through the mission and ministry. Now, examine ourselves. Let's ask ourselves, are we continuing that mission and ministry now? Just think, what are we doing today? It is heartbreaking to see that many private churches are actively engaged in mission work, while well-established churches like the Church of South India, the Lutherans, the Baptist churches that were once known for their service, now the so-called denominational churches are focusing on more on financial security than on the mission. Instead of reaching out to the poor, we are busy in making fixed deposits. How pity. How disgrace. I am not against the financial management, but when did the church become a financial institution instead of a movement of God? Just think, what if the missionaries had thought like this? What if they had prioritized security over sacrifice? Where would we are today? This is not the time for silence. This is the time for action. The church is not a museum of past glory. It is a battlefield of God's kingdom. The souls are perishing. The poor are suffering. Injustice is rising, but the church is sleeping. Enough of this. Enough. It's a time to shake the dust off our feet and return to our true calling. Rise up, step out, break the chains of comfort. Let the fire of mission and ministry burn again in our hearts. Or else, or else, history will judge us. History will judge us, and God will too. Just think of our past and present. And my second observation in Esther chapter 5 verse from 5 to 11, she used privilege for justice. When Esther hears about the Mordecai's mourning, she is disturbed and sends clothes for him, hoping that he will stop. But Mordecai refuses. Instead, he sends a message urging that her to intervene with the king. Esther hesitates, fearing for her life. Esther's first response is ununderstandable. Approaching the king without being called could mean death. Fear keeps many of us from speaking out against injustice, right? Here Mordecai warns Esther that we could see in chapter 4, verse 13, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Dear friends, if Esther remains silent, she will eventually suffer too. But Mordecai reminds her that her position is not for her own comfort, but for a greater purpose. There is a purpose for anything. We could see in Proverbs chapter 31 verse 8, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute, voice for the voiceless. Voice for the voiceless. Jesus himself used his voice for the marginalized. He stood against religious hypocrisy and defended the poor and oppressed in Luke chapter 4 verse 18 to 19. Mordecai's challenge to Esther is one of the famous verses in the Bible. We can see in Esther in verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But if you and your father's family will perish. Now Esther realizes that she cannot remain silent. She cannot remain silent. Now she makes a bold decision that we could see in verse 16. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in the Shushan and fast ye for me, and neither eat or not drink for 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law. If I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. The radical step for her people. The radical step. Esther decided to risk her life. True faith requires the boldness, just as Jesus calls us to take up your cross and follow him. Here, prayer and fasting prepared for their action. Esther asks all the Jews to fast for 3 days before she goes to the king. This shows that the advocacy is not just about speaking up, it is also a spiritual battle. We must seek God's will. We must seek God's strength before going or taking the action. Now Esther moves from fear to the faith. She trusts that God has placed her in this position for a reason. For a reason. The story of Esther, chapter 4, challenges us today that will we stand with the outcast like Mordecai, or will we stay in our comfort like Esther at first? Will you use our voices to defend the weak, or will we stay silent out of fear? Will we trust God and take a stand knowing that he has placed us in the moment for a reason. Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of standing with the outcasts and marginalized. He left his heavenly throne to walk among sinners, to suffer and to save us. He calls us to do the same, to identify with the suffering, to use our privilege for justice and to courageously stand for what is right. God has placed us in His Word for such a time as this. Let us stand with the outcasts, speak for the voiceless, and trust God to use for His glory. In Job chapter 34, verse 28 says, He hears the cry of the afflicted. May we be the hands and voice of the Christ in a world that desperately needs justice and love. And today we read Gospel according to St. Mark chapter 1, verses from 40 to 50. Throughout the history, the society have created divisions between the pure and impure, privileged and oppressed. In India, this reality is seen in the caste system where Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, have faced centuries of discrimination, exclusion, and violence. But Jesus was different. Jesus was different. He never avoided the outcasts, marginalized. He never ignored the oppressed. Instead, that he broke the barriers and embraced the marginalized. In Mark chapter 1, verse 40 to 45, we say that Jesus touches a man with leprosy. Jesus touches a man with leprosy. A man whom society had rejected as unclean. This act speaks powerfully to the struggles of Dalits today and challenges us to follow Christ's radical act. Here I observe some things. My first observation from the Gospel according to St. Mark is Jesus hears the cry of the oppressed. Jesus hears the cry of the oppressed. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees and asking, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing, you can make me clean. The leper in the story was not just a physical sick, he was a social outcast. He was forced to live outside the community and abandoned by family and friends. The religious law in Leviticus chapter 13, verse from 45 to 46 demands that he shout, unclean, unclean, so that people could avoid him. So that people could avoid him. This is the reality of Dalits in India. In many parts of India, despite legal protections, Dalits are still excluded from temples, villages, social gatherings. Many face violence for breaking traditions, just as for leper faced exclusion in Jesus' time. The Dalit theologians like James Massey argues that Jesus' ministry reflects a deep concern for the marginalized. Jesus' ministry reflects a deep concern for the marginalized, making him a liberator for Dalit today. And theologian like Dr. M. Azariah, he calls Jesus the Dalit among Dalits. Jesus the Dalit among the Dalits. Because, like Dalits, Jesus was born in poverty, Jesus was rejected by the society and suffered humiliation just like many Dalits today. That's why Jesus as Dalit. And Jesus touches the untouchable. Jesus was indignant. He reached out of his hands and touched the man. And he asked that, what he asked, are you willing? Are you willing? You can make me clean. No, he's saying, answer that, I am willing, he said. I am willing. He said, be clean. Be clean. This was shocking. The law said, do not touch. But Jesus broke the law of exclusion. Instead of turning away, he reached out and touched the untouchable. Dr. K. Jasiratnam, a Dalit theologian, writes that the untouchability of caste is not just about physical touch, but about power and oppression. It is just about power and oppression. Jesus, by touching the leper, he destroyed this power structure. He destroyed the power structure. And Dalit Christians find hope in Jesus because he embraces those who society rejects. His touch is not just about healing, but about human dignity. His touch is not about healing, but it is about human dignity. Are we willing to break the barriers of caste, class, and religion to embrace the marginalized? Are our churches truly open to Dalits and the oppressed, or do we still practice hidden forms of exclusions? And my next observation is Jesus restores the rejected. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. The healing of the leper was instant. The healing of the leper was instant. But Jesus did more than just heal his skin. He restored his place in the society. He restored his place in the society. Now he was clean. Before that he was unclean. Now he is clean. Jesus restored his place in the society. Jesus told him, go show yourself to the priest. Why? Why? Because in Jewish law, only a priest could declare someone clean and allow them back into the society. That's why Jesus told him to go show yourself to the priest. Dalit theologian like Arvind P. Nirmal, the founder of the Dalit theologian, argues that salvation in Christ is not just spiritual, it is social, it is political, and it is economic. The gospel is about justice and restoration. The gospel is about justice and restoration. Liberation theologians reminds us that the kingdom of God is not just about heaven. It is just about breaking injustice on earth. Dear friends, don't breaking this injustice on earth. How you can see that heaven? Jesus restores the leprosy dignity. Are we working to restore the dignity of Dalits in our churches and communities? Are we silent about caste discrimination, or are we actively working for the challenges? True Christian means standing with the oppressed just as Christ did. Standing with the Dalits. Walking with the Jesus. Jesus walked toward the rejected, touched the untouchable, and restored the outcast. This is the call of the church today. Dalits are still fighting for justice. Will we stand with them? Many Christians still practice the caste system in hidden ways. Will we challenge this hypocrisy? Jesus broke the barriers. Will we? The message of Mark chapter 1, verse from 40 to 50 is clear that Jesus is with the oppressed. Jesus is with the oppressed. Jesus is with the Dalits. Are we? Dear friends, today we have heard the cries of the marginalized, the outcasts, and the forgotten. We have seen how Mordecai stood for his people, how Esther risked everything, and how Jesus himself embraced the untouchables, the sinners, and the rejected. Their stories are not just the ancient history, they are a call to us today. We cannot remain silent. We can turn away. The church is not meant to be a place of a comfort, but a movement of transformation. If we truly follow Christ, we must be ready to break barriers, challenge injustice, and stand with those whom society has pushed aside. Look around. Who are the outcasts in our communities? Who are the ones we ignore, ones we mistreat, ones we consider unworthy? Are we truly living as Christ's hands and feet in this world? Just think. If Jesus were walking along among with us today, where would he be? If Jesus were walking among us today, where would he be? Would he be sitting in the grand churches like us? No. Or he would be in the streets among the poor, the sick and the broken? Let us wake up. Let us return to the mission of the Jesus. The time for mere word is over. This is the time for action. This is the time for action. Just think about the past. Let us stand for justice even when it is difficult. Let us break the chains of caste, class, and the discriminations. Let us be a church that welcomes the rejected, loves the unloved, and lifts the fallen. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, God has placed us here for such a time as this. Just as Esther was called to stand for her people, we are called to stand for the suffering in our society. This is not someone's responsibility, but it is ours. It is our responsibility to stand for justice. Will you remain silent or will you rise up? Will you ignore the pain around you or will you be the hands of Christ to heal the restore? The choice is yours. The call is clear. Let us be the church that Jesus died for us. A church that stands with the outcasts, speak the voiceless, and fight for the dignity of every human being. May God gives us the courage to live this truth, not just in words, but in actions. Amen.